IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. One of the things that I most miss about the Takshashila office is this beautiful little coffee machine that we used to have. I would show up super early every morning because I was a podcasting nerd even back then. And in the mornings were the only time when the office was actually quiet and I could get some recordings done. And what I particularly used to enjoy was just sitting down with a hot cup of black coffee, looking at Church Street, which is where our office is, slowly coming awake in the early morning. It's really one of my favorite pleasures of life in Bangalore. Today, I'm going to be trying to do a little bit of homage to that aspect of life at Takshashila. And of course, one thing that I particularly enjoy is, of course, thinking about the history of various things and how the way that we live today is impacted by things that have gone down over the many, many centuries through which the subcontinent has kind of voyaged through the past, along with the other areas to which it's connected. And it turns out that coffee is one of those things which exemplifies these interconnectedness in a way that few other things do, because coffee, as many of you might know, is not actually native to India. What we're going to be doing over the course of this episode is we're going to be talking about where exactly coffee comes from, how it came to India, how it was seen in India, how it was received in India, and how it is that coffee has become such a quintessential aspect of South Indian culture. You would have heard, of course, of the famous Bangalore filter kapi. If you're from Chennai, then you would know that Chennai also has its own unique coffee drinking culture. And so too, in various ways, do Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, and Kerala. It's really one of the most quintessential drinks of southern India. I have with me today my friend Sujata Shukla. Sujata is a former chartered accountant. She's also an author who writes a lot about food history. Most recently, she's written a very interesting book about sacred foods in India, which we'll put a link to in the description of this podcast. So you can definitely check it out if you're interested. And what we're going to be doing over the course of this discussion is Sujata is going to be taking us through this fascinating history of coffee and how this plant, which originates in Ethiopia and Arabia, came to be grown in massive plantations in southern India. And as I said earlier, has become so integral to the way that we live our lives today. So Sujata, welcome to All Things Policy. It's a real pleasure to have you back here again.
Good morning, Anirudh. I'm so happy to be here.
It's our pleasure. So let's begin. Let's try to understand first what was really like consumed in India before coffee. Like as I said earlier, coffee isn't really an Indian plant, but drinking something nice and hot on cold days seems to be a fundamental aspect of the human condition. So what exactly was it that was being consumed as a hot beverage in India before the arrival of coffee?
Well, Anirudh, you'll probably be surprised to hear that there really wasn't a concept of a morning drink in those days, hot or otherwise. Water drained from cooked rice was a normal morning consumption across India. In Tamil Nadu, or rather the Madras Presidency as it then was, A.R. Venkatachalapati in his essay, in those days there was no coffee, says that Neeragaram, which is water drained from cooked rice or from other cooked grains, fermented for several hours or overnight, to which you add salt and water, that was a regular refreshment.
Interesting.
An important morning intake was leftover rice, soaked in water overnight, consumed the next day with buttermilk and salt, as well as pickles and other side dishes. This was there across India. In Tamil Nadu, it was called Pareda in Tamil, really. It's called Pantabat in Bengal, Pointabat in Assam, Gilbat in Bihar, Chadanam in Andhra and Telangana, Pakhanabat in Odisha. So many different names in each region.
So this thing is basically like it's like an accompaniment to breakfast rather than a drink that stands on its own, basically.
It was breakfast.
Oh, interesting.
This is what people ate even before going out to the fields. The agriculturist would have some pareda and go out, or just drink the water drained from soaked rice. Okay, there was no concept of a drink in the morning. There was no real breakfast concept. You ate a little bit of rice or drank rice water. You went to the fields and then you had a midday meal. I was chatting with an elderly cousin recently, and she said that apart from water from cooked rice, other popular items in the Tamil community were kanji of different kinds. A gruel, rava or suji kanji, sometimes rice kanji, paitam parpu or moong dal kanji. In fact, Anirudh, I guess it shows my age. I remember my mother making this moong dal kanji on festival days when lunch would be delayed until puja was done. So we needed something a little substantial in the morning. In the book in the book Modern South India, Rajmohan Gandhi refers to a report by the East India Company's Madras Army, which gives a lot of inputs about lifestyle and food and other things. And it says there that a large proportion of the laboring people subsist upon ragi made into a paste with buttermilk. This paste is what we call kur in Tamil. I don't think there is an English equivalent, but it would be something of the texture of a custard. Another traditional gruel, which is popular even today, is made from wheat, ragi, moong dal, other grains and lentils. Each is roasted separately, ground and mixed together, often lightly flavored with cardamom, sweetened with palm sugar. These were the things which people would eat. And let's not forget toddy, which was a preferred drink, definitely in rural South India as well as in other places.
Oh, right in the morning.
Yes.
That's not like a fun life. But so I'm just curious. So it seems like what was consumed in the morning was very much suited to the way that people live their daily lives. Like, as you said, it's something that they would consume before going to the fields, and while they were in the field is when they would actually have their first meal of the day. So how exactly did things change there? How did coffee first enter the Indian subcontinent, and how did it gradually begin to impact people's dietary habits?
So about the origins of coffee, and I hope you are in the mood to listen to some stories, because I'm going to talk about a couple of legends connected to the origins of coffee.
Sure.
It all started, they say, in Ethiopia. The coffee tree, Coffea arabica, is indigenous to Ethiopia. And there was this young Ethiopian goat herd, Kaldi. One day, Kaldi observed that his goats, even old and weak ones, were bounding about on the hillside and did not sleep at night after consuming some red berries from shrubs growing nearby. Kaldi, being tired and troubled, also tried eating some of the berries and immediately felt refreshed. So Kaldi and his goats began to eat berries every day. A monk from a nearby monastery saw them and asked about the strange behavior. When he heard the story of the frolicking goats, he sampled some berries, felt exhilaration flow through his body. One version of the legend, he said he boiled some of the berries in water to make a drink for all the monks so that they could stay alert for religious services. This news soon spread to other monasteries. The drink became known, it is said, as kawa, and it was invigorating and stimulating. Then there's another legend narrated from the manuscript Abd al-Qadir. The dervish Omar, who had the ability to cure the sick through prayer, was exiled from Mocha in Yemen to a desert cave near a place called Osab. He could find nothing to eat except some berries in a shrub nearby. They were bitter, so he tried roasting them, at which point they became hard. So he tried to soften them by boiling and drank the water. This drink revitalized him and staved off hunger. When people from the vicinity came to him for healing, he offered them this drink, and they were cured of their ills. The stories of the miracle drug reached Mocha, and Umar was called back from exile and acclaimed a saint. The Signet Book of Coffee and Tea suggests that coffee perhaps took several forms before it settled down as a beverage we know today. Earlier,
So it was consumed in many different ways.
Many different ways. Ethiopians used to chew them as leaves. It was consumed as a food. Then it began to be boiled into a drink. There were tribals who crushed the berries with animal fat, shaped the mixture into balls called iron rations, and these were carried and consumed by warriors and those traveling on long journeys. So in this way, coffee made its way to Yemen and the rest of Arabia, where it seems to have been first cultivated. The pulp was earlier on fermented into a wine, and perhaps that is why the name kawa, which also means wine, is used for coffee. By mid-15th century CE, coffee, it seems, began to be popular in Yemen first as an aid to religious exercises by dervishes, and then by travelers. Its fame spread to Mecca and Medina, where it was likely taken after roasting, grinding, boiling in water, with the grounds being consumed along with the liquid.
There's such an interesting history, and what I find especially curious is the fact that these stories, which are probably apocryphal, I personally very much doubt that there was one specific quote heard or one specific individual who was exiled and discovered this. To me, at least, it's interesting how there's these stories always include this kind of undercurrent of spirituality to kind of legitimize the drink, right? Is that it was used by the monks or it was used for healing by a man who, seen as holy. And therefore, this is the reason why it
there's
grew
a
in popularity.
justification as to why the drink was taken in the first place, no?
Exactly. And like what I also find interesting is there's this really beautiful work by Orhan Pamuk, which is like literary/historical fiction set in Istanbul in the 16th century. And incidentally, coffee houses and social reactions to coffee houses, especially by Orthodox clerics, are actually a very big plot point in the book. So that's doubly interesting to me because we were talking a little earlier, Sujata, about how the justifications or the origin stories given for coffee are always linked to spirituality in some way, but not orthodox spirituality. So it's always this kind of spirituality of the wilderness in a way, that's kind of used to justify the consumption of it, which is quite interesting. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about how coffee was received, not just over the world, but also in India specifically. But before that, let's just go to a quick ad break.
Artificial intelligence, what is that? It sure sounds like science fiction, but it's very much a part of our world today. But most of us lack understanding and a means to use AI to our advantage. Luckily though, Intel's Digital Readiness Program empowers everyone with skill sets, mindsets, and tool sets to use in an AI-fueled world, so you don't end up like me. The Intel AI for Youth program is an initiative that guides today's youth to an understanding of AI, how it is designed, and why it's important today. Intel's been working with the CBSE, Ministry of Education, and the Government of India to empower today's youth to build social impact solutions while demystifying what AI is. How do you take advantage of this? Purchase an Intel Core-powered PC and you get free access to 80+ hours of immersive and hands-on training about AI. On completion of the program, along with a certificate, you get access to AI toolsets to try put what you learn to good use. Log on to futurebanaowonderful.intel.com. Future Banao Wonderful by bringing home an Intel-powered PC.
And we're back. So we're talking about how coffee was received in the 15th and 16th centuries as it began to become a more commonly consumed commodity across the Indian Ocean world from its origins as a drink in Yemen. So Sujata, tell us, what do you think about the way that coffee was received in, say, India, for example?
This is fascinating, Anirudh, though I don't know much about what happened during the Ottoman regime. In India, it was pretty late before Indians began to consume coffee. It was probably in 1918 or so that coffee began to be taken in homes in the pre-independence Madras presidency, which covered the present southern states, as you know. Drinking coffee was a sign of modernity. Only very rich families and those two usually from upper caste could do so. And they usually drank it not the way we do now, but dark and thick. A.R. Venkatachalapati gives us glimpses of coffee's encroachment into South Indian homes. He said that in the early 20th century, there were many complaints in the press about the popularity of this new brew. F.R. Hemingway wrote in the Tanjore Gazetteer, and I quote, "Among the higher classes, coffee in the morning is taken. Of recent years, however, a tendency has become noticeable among Shudras, even of the poorer classes, towards the use of coffee in the early morning in preference to cold rice." Another writer, H.R. Patti, said of the Tirunelveli Tamil Society, that was a small town at that time, "The old practice of taking kanji or cold rice water in the early morning is rapidly giving way to coffee drinking, a degenerate innovation at which the older generation shake their heads. Even Pallans, a Dalit caste, in some parts, insist on having their cup of coffee before they go out to work. With the younger members of the richer classes, the custom of drinking coffee is almost general." Yet another complaint from a Tamil scholar and critic was, "New beverages like coffee and tea have become the order of the day. Without such drinks, no work gets done." The common refrain, Anirudh, was, "Coffee drinking is not required in our nation. Our ancestors never ever consumed it." Sounds familiar, Anirudh?
It sounds very familiar.
A large section of Gandhians started condemning coffee. It soon became known as Kutikal, a junior version of alcohol, among chaste Gandhians. Coffee's biggest proponent, however, was freedom fighter and premier of Madras presidency, among other things, C. Rajagopalacharya, who expressed a wish that the Kaveri would flow with coffee.
Very interesting. But okay, so I feel like So these are interesting reactions, but we've jumped about like 300 years to get to the point where coffee is this ubiquitous, right? So how did that actually come to happen? Like, was coffee being cultivated in India even before it was actually being consumed at a wide scale, or like how did it really take root in India?
So we again come back to a legend. The oft repeated and believed story is that possibly in 1670, a Muslim divine, Baba Budan, brought back 7 green coffee seeds when he returned to India after a pilgrimage to Mecca. Baba Budan lived in a cave in Chikamagalur hills in Karnataka, and he planted the seeds nearby. K.T. Achaya says that the descendants of the original plants are still to be seen near the cave where the Baba Budan shrine now stands. There is some gap in detail after this. It's not very clear how well or otherwise those plants developed, what level of cultivation followed. But the Dutch started cultivation in southern India and some other parts of the country. But the plantations came into their own in India only when the demand for coffee, tea, and spices was very high in England and Europe. The British gave impetus to coffee cultivation in the 1830s, setting up several large coffee estates in Chikmagalur and other areas such as Chevroi Hills, later on the Nilgiris and Wayanad. Coffee trading actually started. This is from an article by Sandeep Srinivasa in Caldron magazine, where he says that J.H. Jolly, an enterprising British manager working for Parry and Company of Madras, felt that coffee beans growing in Chandragiri in the Babu Budan Hills had huge potential. He approached the Mysore government of the day for 40 acres, and Maharaja Krishnaraja Wodeyar decided to move from the Hitana coffee, that is coffee grown in backyard system, to go for estate-based economic models, where he gave away land in exchange for a share of the coffee produce. He sold the collection rights of the Mysore Princely State coffee to Paris for 10 years, from 1823 to 1833, for an assured yearly sum of 4,270 rupees. The plantations thrived and grew rapidly and brought with them all the evils. Slavery, which later on gave way to bonded labor. Even after organized slavery was officially done away with, the conditions of laborers did not change. Human labor was exploited to the full, as for natural resources, as forests were destroyed to create the plantations. Poverty and periodic famine conditions brought immigrant labor from Salem, Madurai, Ramnath, Tirunelveli, Mysore, etc. in droves to the plantations, and later on from North India too. The onset of leaf disease in 1870, along with other factors, such as the adoption of the Ceylon method of growing coffee without shade, which did not suit Indian conditions, as well as the gold boom and mushrooming of many mining companies, led to the failure of large Arabica plantations. This encouraged the growing of tea as well as quinine on a large scale. Actually, first quinine and then tea plantations. However, the cultivation of coffee survived, with many estates moving to Robusta or to blends of Arabica. Today, as you know, a lot of Indian coffee is grown under natural shade canopy of forests in the Western and Eastern Ghats. And there was one very interesting crop which was totally developed by India. It is called the monsoon crop, a very unique process of treating coffee. The transport of green coffee to Europe took a sea voyage of several months, during which time humidity and damp sea winds caused the beans to swell and age. I would have thought this created a problem, but actually the problem surfaced when voyage time reduced, storage conditions improved, the beans were less affected by the elements, and European coffee drinkers observed that their coffee was losing its character and distinctive strong flavors. So coffee merchants in India began to create the monsoon crop to replicate sea voyage conditions. They would store green sun-dried coffee in open-sided warehouse in coastal regions, allowing moist tropical air from the monsoon winds between June, July to October to blow through the beans for 2-3 months. The beans would absorb moisture, lose some of the natural acidity, swell to about double their original size, and become brittle and pale.
Interesting.
The resulting Mansoor Malabar coffee became very popular for its earthy, pungent flavors. And even today, you will probably find it used to add body and weight to fine espresso blends.
Okay, this is so interesting. I'm going to kind of try and connect all the dots that have been laid out so far in this conversation, right? So we start off with a society, at least in southern India, having a separate morning drink is not really a concept. You usually have a nutritious kind of gruel in the mornings and then have a heavier meal later in the day. And around the same time, you have a situation where gradually in the Arabian Peninsula, specifically in Yemen and just across the Red Sea in Ethiopia, gradually coffee is being consumed in various ways, initially by, wandering cultures and peoples, and then gradually it was starting to enter kind of urban centers such as the great port of Mocha, for example. And from there, it's gaining popularity because of various legends that are starting to originate that are kind of associated with this kind of spirituality of the wilderness. Its popularity is growing across the Arabian Peninsula. From there, it seems to enter the rest of the Islamicate world, especially into Turkey and Persia. And from there, also by 1670, seems to arrive in India. And again, I find it very interesting that in India, it's a Muslim saint who's given the credit for doing this. And I just find that very interesting in today's day and age, when Muslim Indians are very often kind of reduced to this simplistic political binary that seeks to paint them as responsible for all incidents of religious violence, that Indian Muslims have also contributed and added so much to the history of India in much more profound ways that continue to impact our lives and for the better, I would say, especially if you're a coffee drinker today. So that's interesting. But when this individual brings these coffee plants, if he actually did that, of course, they don't really seem to be that popular until this global market is created across Europe for coffee by the colonial period, at which point of time, thanks to the centralization of the Mysore state, for example, you finally have a situation where you can undertake large scale plantation farms. And the aspect of like the exploitation of labor that he brought up is very interesting to me, Sujata, because the intersection of caste and class and colonialism and capitalism in the 19th, 20th century world is something that's definitely worth trying to understand better, right? Because India was certainly not a haven before all these forces were introduced, but after they were introduced, these conditions kind of took on new and very, very damaging kind of implications. Not that they were not damaging before, but you get what I mean. The scale of it is just so much vaster. And to hear about how even within this exploitative system that is created to kind of create coffee for foreign markets, you gradually see these new kinds of innovations happening, and then culturally things begin to change as initially elite Indians, and then more rapidly most sections of Indian society start to catch on to this like trendy new idea and start to consume it. And of course, the grumpy old gentlemen have an issue with that and complain about how it's not part of our culture and so on. It's so interesting kind of see how the same dynamic, if not necessarily for coffee or even for a particular kind of food, but more generally for various cultural products that have gained currency in India more recently and are being kind of Indianized in various ways, seem to kind of prompt the same reaction from Orthodox certain society. It's very interesting to me to see the same kind of dynamic kind of repeating, history kind of echoing in a sense over all these centuries.
Anirudh, I'd like to add here that even how people drank coffee depended on their class. Would you like to hear a couple of instances of how people drank coffee?
Yes, of course. In fact, I just want to add one quick comment is that you mentioned that one of these, grumpy old Orthodox dudes who was like commenting about this was especially singled out Dalits for drinking coffee.
Yes,
almost like he was shocked at the audacity of these people for doing something that was generally linked to the upper classes.
No? Yeah.
It's a little ridiculous, but it is something that is worth kind of calling out. Is that clearly these individuals saw they saw it as a sign of status, and it was somewhat resisted when they kind of took this agency for themselves. But let's come back to what you were saying, Sujata.
So the works of Tamilian writers from Subramania Bharati to Perumal Murugan to R.K. Narayan, they all give us glimpses of Tamil lifestyles in which coffee was very much a part of the day. And if you look at how coffee was drunk by people of different classes, there's a fascinating book called Tiffin, a food book and memoir. Rukmani Srinivas tells us in that book about a visit to an elderly and orthodox aunt in Madras between 1939 and 1946 or so. The aunt would drink coffee from a silver tumbler and davara, both of which were edged with a narrow lip or rim, which permitted liquids, I've used these, Anirudh, which permitted liquids to be poured in a steady stream without spilling. Touching the lips to the tumbler was considered polluting. Rukmani describes the aunt's style of drinking coffee. With her head slightly tilted back, raising the silver tumbler at least 2 inches above her mouth, she tipped it ever so slightly, and the streaming coffee poured in a steady stream into her gullet. Silver, by the way, was believed to be so pure a metal that it could not be polluted by cooked food, which in this case included coffee. In the English translation of Perumal Burgad's Seasons of the Farm, the boy Shorty, the protagonist, considered an untouchable, serving in bonded labor to the landlord, eagerly anticipates the coffee he gets every morning. Shorty is one of the very few of his kind who gets coffee with milk rather than a bitter black brew. The mistress pours thick, milky coffee into the coconut shell that serves as his bowl. He sits by the kitchen door, sipping slowly from the bowl, not wanting to lose a single drop and not wanting this moment to ever end, which of course it does.
Interesting. So the sense I'm getting from all this, Sujata, is that though the media that survives is obviously written by people who are clearly not very big fans of coffee drinking, the reality of it, the fact that they are reacting to this new kind of cultural trend is that coffee was becoming far more prevalent and far more ubiquitous. And it was really bringing people together in various ways, right? We're talking about a time in the early 20th century when political consciousness is gradually increasing. Society all across the subcontinent is going through some very profound changes. And you have groups of young people and intellectuals and politically aware individuals who are sitting down and like figuring out new ideas and new ways they think the country should be run. So, what kind of role did coffee play in all this?
The history of coffee seems to be synonymous with revolutionaries and freedom fighters. Coffee also brought people together in very different ways. In an Agastya's Reminiscences, Sri Ganesh Shukla describes 3 political addas in Lucknow in pre-independence and immediate post-partition India. Political leaders, workers, writers, academics, poets, revolutionaries, journalists, all gathered in the evenings, as also did intelligence youths. Of these addas, the most popular was a Lucknow coffee house in Hazratganj, which the author says was a replica of a Parisian cafe. You could drop in the morning, order a cup of coffee, stay there for hours, writing, talking to others around you, even compose poems if that is what you did. Communists, socialists, congressmen, all bonded over coffee. And a large part of the planning and plotting during the freedom struggle happened in these coffee houses. Young people loved the coffee houses. Leaders were made there, youth inducted into political parties, views exchanged and argued over. And Anirudh, a cup of coffee in 1947 cost 25 paise or a quarter of a rupee, which in those days was quite a large amount to pay for a drink, which visitors from rural areas coming for the first time considered a very bitter drink, not high in flavor at all.
Interesting. So we're talking about these elite cafes, basically, right? When we talk about it, if they built an imitation of a Parisian restaurant, if they're charging that much, these are clearly made by elite actors for elite actors. But were there also ways to kind of quote unquote democratize coffee? Was it also being consumed in new kinds of spaces that were run by and for working class individuals?
The coffee house I'm referring to is part of the India Coffee House chain. See, there were coffee houses as early as perhaps 1780. At the Raj at the table, David Burton refers to a coffee house set up in Calcutta in 1780, and then of the Madras Coffee House shortly thereafter. But these are all meant only for Europeans. India Coffee House, set up in 1936, made coffee houses or cafes popular with young people. Nandita Huxter says in The Flavors of Nationalism that in the 1940s, there were nearly 50 coffee houses all over British India. And these were open to Indians. When in the mid-1950s, the Coffee Board decided to close down the coffee houses, communist leader A.K. Gopalan organized the discharged workers and their cooperative. The Indian Coffee House, that is the cooperative, that is the Indian Coffee House, took over the running of coffee houses across India. In fact, an article by the team of Hindustan Times Branch in August 2013 tells us that the United Coffee House, which opened in 1942 in Connaught Place, Delhi, was a haunt of the arty crowd that loved its jukebox. Coffee there cost 90 paise. So coffee was high priced. It did cost more than tea, but still it was popular. Perhaps that's where our 1x2 coffee first came into being. I don't know.
No, it's actually quite possible, I think. So, well, I mean, the more I think about it, like the less I'd actually expected that the history of coffee would actually contain so many of these stories, right? We have, and like, thank you so much for like bringing up all these like deeply researched points, Sujata. You've taken us from Ethiopia and Yemen in the 14th, 15th centuries, all the way to India in the 20th century. And it really seems that this brink across such a wide array of cultures and economic systems has been the site of so much contestation and innovation. And every drop that we drink to this day kind of encapsulates all that. It encapsulates the suffering of the plantation workers. It encapsulates these ideas of coming together and adopting this new kind of cultural lifestyle over so many centuries. It's pretty mind-blowing to think about. So thank you so much for bringing all this to life for us.
Thank you, Anirudh. And the more I study Indian food history, the more fascinated I'm becoming. Thank you for this opportunity to study this area.
No, it's absolutely my pleasure. Also, thank you all for listening. On that note, I hope that you have enjoyed your morning coffee and your morning podcast. And thank you so much for listening to All Things Policy. And we will see you again on Monday.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hey everybody, it's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus says, actor and author Kalki Ketla talk about her amazing new book, Elephant in the Womb. As Cyrus and Kalki go through some funny illustrations in the book, Kalki brings up what people don't talk about when it comes to pregnancy. On The Habit Coach, Ashton explains an interesting perspective on the Teflon mindset. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth debates whether thrift stores will remain a niche thing or accepted by the Indian masses. On Press Decode with Vagda, Sareen, and Sarah, they discuss how India dropped by 7 spots in the latest Global Hunger Index rankings. On Hansvani, here's this fascinating story. It's titled Helium and it's written by Lalit Karthike and narrated by Casey Shankar. And it's such a really, really good thing. Definitely check that out. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quarter, CoinSwitch, Kuber, Slay Coffee, Intel, Kotak Mahindra Bank, and Oxfam India. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Eventually, you'll see the end of your childhood.
Get accustomed to womanhood.
Enjoy the experience of sisterhood.
Might get to wifehood.
Or not. Choose motherhood.
Or not. You'll learn to define your personhood.
Earn a livelihood.
Change the neighborhood.
And get rid of the falsehood that life post-academia is easy.
So join me, Natasha.
And me, Ayushi.
On a journey from station starting point.
To station, what now?
Next station, Pudin station. And hopefully, Agla station, adulthood.
Fresh episodes out every Thursday.